Hello bikers and booty likers, Aaron here, back with another video, this time with the much anticipated Pyro Archon MAVUIKA. But what does she do? How does she work best? How does she have a motorcycle if no one in Genshin has ever seen one before? Before I answer most of these questions, I just have to say that if you do like my content, why not take a bite out of that photo flavored subscribe button down below. But with that done, let's drift our way right into MAVUIKA'S overview. MAVUIKA is a Pyro main DPS unit that can also function as an all-field DPS, and she's a unit that excels when paired with other Natlin units. MAVUIKA'S skill has a tap and hold version, but both have her deal AoE pyro damage to enemies, which generates 5 particles on hit. It grants her Night Soul points equal to her maximum of 80, and it puts her in the Night Soul state. Her tap version unlocks her off-field kit, as it has her summon a ring behind active character that will drain 5 Night Soul points from MAVUIKA per second, granting it a duration of 16 seconds. During its duration, it will deal pyro damage and apply pyro to up to 10 nearby targets, including bloom cores, once every 2 seconds. Her hold version unlocks her on-field kit, as it has her hop atop her motorcycle. While on this bike, she will gain enhancements to her normal and charged attacks, and her dash will also deal damage to enemies. This bike can also be used in the overworld to traverse quickly across land, ride up cliffs, fly, and ride water, though the duration for these activities is incredibly short, about sometimes 3 seconds, sometimes more, sometimes less. It mostly depends on the activity. MAVUIKA'S Elemental Burst is up next, and it's unique as it does not require energy to be cast. Instead, it requires 50% of her maximum fighting spirit. Since the maximum fighting spirit she can have is 200, this means that she needs 100 fighting spirit to cast her Elemental Burst. For every Night Soul point consumed, MAVUIKA receives 1 point of fighting spirit, and every normal attack performed grants her 1.5 points of fighting spirit. When her burst is cast, she deals a large chunk of AoE pyro damage, it restores 10 Night Soul points to her, and it has MAVUIKA enter the Crucible of Death and Life state for 7 seconds. This state reduces the Night Soul consumption amount for her various actions to 0, it increases her interruption resistance to 100%, making her uninterruptible, and it buffs the scaling values of her bursts, normal attacks, and charge attacks based on the amount of fighting spirit stacks she had when she cast her burst. MAVUIKA'S Ascension 1 passive increases her attack by 30% for 10 seconds after Night Soul Burst is triggered. However, because only Xilonen can control when Night Soul Burst is triggered, this effect will usually occur at the start of the rotation, at which point MAVUIKA will not have the buff for any part of her kit other than her burst. MAVUIKA'S Ascension 4 passive increases the damage percent of the on-field unit by 0.2% for each stack of fighting spirit she has, up to a maximum of 40% when she casts her elemental burst. This buff will then decay over the course of the next 20 seconds. MAVUIKA'S talent priority can sometimes depend on how you plan to use her, but as a stable guideline, level up her elemental skill and burst at the same time with a slight preference on her skill. This is due to the fact that her skill holds most of her damage multipliers, and while her burst might enhance them too, it's not to the same degree and it does not buff her off-field elemental skill damage, so just level these two together, but keep her skill level at least 1 level higher or equal to that of her burst. Her normal attacks you can ignore though, since they hold none of her damage except in a Xianyun team, because of MAVUIKA'S ability to be used as a main DPS, sub DPS, and support, and because she could be used as a normal attack, charge attack, plunging attack, burst damage, and skill damage dealer, she has many different combos to use that depend on the circumstance. To keep this short, I will quickly go over each, but in all situations, MAVUIKA would want to use her elemental burst right after using her elemental skill. MAVUIKA deals the most damage as a main DPS using a charge attack playstyle, but many supports cannot support this playstyle. In teams that can, MAVUIKA would want to use her hold skill and hold the charge attack button to do donuts with her motorbike on the enemy. In situations where you do not have the characters needed to support her charge attack playstyle, her best option would be to use her hold skill and use her normal attacks. Since these normal attacks have nearly all the same scalings, the combo you use matters very little, so use whichever feels best to you, though try to avoid using the final hit because it's rather slow. As an off-field unit, you'll want to use her right before the main DPS so they can make use of the large 50% damage bonus buff MAVUIKA can offer. If you want to use her as a burst DPS, use her burst, but if you want her off-field pyro application and damage, then you could use her tap skill afterward. MAVUIKA'S base kit is incredibly strong and versatile, but with the downside that it has one large restriction. Thankfully, we have her Constellations to clear up that restriction while also buffing the living daylights out of her. MAVUIKA'S first Constellation increases her Night Soul point limit to 120 and also increases her fighting spirit gathering efficiency by 25%. On top of that, MAVUIKA gets a 40% attack bonus for 8 seconds after she gains any amount of fighting spirit. These bonuses are phenomenal for MAVUIKA. The first increases her off-field damage uptime to 24 seconds, and it increases her effective fighting spirit amount from 80 to 150, completely fixing her largest issue that held her back from being an Archon material. This enables her to use her ultimate every rotation, and therefore makes her a much more versatile buffing support and damage dealer. On top of that, she will get an effectively permanent 40% attack bonus to all of her damage, which is incredibly good, especially for an attack scaler that really desires the attack stat. These buffs are pretty strong overall, and when tied with her versatility increase, massively boosts the potency of MAVUIKA. MAVUIKA's second constellation increases her base attack, not overall attack stat. This is a base attack increase, and the only one in the game at that, by 200. On top of that, her skill is enhanced depending on the form that is used. When her sub DPS skill is used, nearby opponents have their defense reduced by 20%, and when her main DPS skill is used, she gains increased scaling on her normal and charge attacks, plus elemental burst. Every single effect of this constellation is absolutely insane. The 200 base attack increase dramatically boosts her damage by 16 to 21% alone, as it's basically impossible to increase, making it very valuable to harsh attack scalers like MAVUIKA. This multiplies heavily off of the additional attack scaling on her normal and charge attacks, or exceedingly rare defense shred she can apply to enemies. This increases MAVUIKA's damage by about 50% and can increase the team damage by almost 12%. This constellation is disgustingly overpowered, as its power rivals the damage and utility of most other characters' 6th constellations, making it one of the best in the game. MAVUIKA's third constellation increases the level of her elemental burst by 3. This increases her burst scaling, but also the additional burst, normal attack, and charge attack scaling she gets from Fighting Spirit. This leads to a relatively decent damage increase for a talent level up, but it's nothing phenomenal. Her C2 is her worst constellation though, as it merely increases the damage bonus cap for Ascension passive by 10%, while also removing the decay effect from this passive. These buffs are minor though, since they will usually lead to only about an extra 20% damage bonus on average for a main DPS. This might sound good, but everyone has a ridiculous amount of damage percent nowadays, so it's not that great. MAVUIKA's C5 increases the talent level for elemental skill, which would increase her off-field pyro damage scaling and the scaling of her motorbike's normal and charge attacks. This makes up most of her damage in general, which inevitably leads to quite a great damage increase. And finally, we have MAVUIKA's final constellation. This monster massively buffs her automatic off-field damage, since whenever its effect fires and deals damage, it will now trigger another single instance of damage in an AoE, though this damage does not apply pyro. On top of that, when MAVUIKA is used as an on-field DPS, she will summon her off-field damage ring, but it will now deal an instance of pyro damage once per 3 seconds and has a larger damage multiplier. This is absolutely ridiculous, as she now always applies the 20% defense shred from her C2, no matter if she's used on or off field. On top of that, the extra damage instances from the auto damage on her skill will increase her overall damage both on and off field by a ludicrous amount. This constellation is so broken that at this point, she'd be dealing 3 times the damage she was dealing at C0. However, if she is used as a main DPS, it can lock her off from certain comps that might benefit heavily from her having a slower pyro application. Overall though, MAVUIKA's constellations are insanely good, to the point that they're overkill. The moment you get her first one is the moment she becomes a contender for the best character in the game. Her C0 offers only about 5% less of a damage increase than that of her signature weapon, while fixing her main issue at C0. This enables her to act as an overpowered DPS or support in every single pyro-related team. Her C2 frees her even more, to the point that you don't need to think about the team damage for her to be out-damaging all other DPS units both on and off field. When mentioning her vertical investment path, this is where I'd suggest moving on to other units. This is not because MAVUIKA has no other good vertical upgrades past this point, but it's because everything after this is effectively pointless. Upgrading her anymore would mean the difference between nuking the world into oblivion and nuking the world into oblivion minus $1,500. But if you do want to vertically invest more into MAVUIKA, then go for her weapon, and then go right for that C6. With constellations over with, let's move on to building MAVUIKA, starting with her artifact choices. MAVUIKA's best in slot artifact option for her as a main DPS right now is Obsidian Codex, because of the huge crit rate and great all-around damage percent buff it offers. This is phenomenal for all Natlan main DPS units, but despite it being MAVUIKA's best in slot set, it currently has one large flaw. The crit rate buff from this set is not taken into account for her elemental burst. This large flaw is the main reason as to why there is currently a good bit of speculation that there might be a new set specifically for MAVUIKA down the line. If you don't have a good Obsidian set for MAVUIKA, then Mauritius A Hunter could be a good option if you use her alongside Furina, as it can massively boost the consistency of crit hits from her elemental burst. This matters so much for her that when used with Furina, this set can sometimes perform better than Obsidian Codex. So use whichever one has the better substats for now, but keep an ear out for what the next artifact sets can do, as they may potentially be better for MAVUIKA in the long run. MAVUIKA is not just a main DPS though, as she can also be used to support support her team from off-field. While off-field, she could support using the scroll artifact set for the team-wide 40% damage bonus. This in and of itself is so good for her that it will usually be her best in slot off-field set, even though she gains no benefit from the two-piece effect, and sometimes even if another character like Shallonen is using it. However, if there is a situation where the 4-piece effect is being double-dipped, then she could swap to Golden Troop, Unfinished Reverie, Gilded Dreams, Lava Walker, or any two-piece combo that benefits skill damage, attack, elemental mastery, or pyro damage. For MAVUIKA'S main stats, it's the same as every other main DPS. You're looking to go for an attack percent Sands with the option to replace it for an elemental mastery one if you have too much attack, pyro damage goblet, and a crit circlet. Her substats situation is pretty similar, as you would want up to 70% crit rate even if you are using the Obsidian Codex set. This is because her elemental burst, which can make up to about 25% of her total damage output, will not gain the 40% crit rate buff from this set. This means that building more crit, even to the point of overcapping by a pretty decent amount, will usually be better overall for her damage and consistency than losing stats from overcapping crit. After that, look for crit damage, aiming around 200%, then attack of 1600 at the bare minimum before buffs, and an elemental mastery stat of 100 or higher after buffs. MAVUIKA has a crap ton of utility in her kit and artifacts, which is what makes her strong as a support. So, when mentioning her weapons, I will focus this mostly on her main DPS playstyle, since that's where it matters most. 1000 Blazing Suns is MAVUIKA'S best in slot claymore, and it is the new best claymore in the game. Huge base attack, crit rate, crit damage, attack percent, what's not to love? It offers huge stats to every single attack scaling claymore user, which is basically all of them, and MAVUIKA scales the hardest off of it. On top of that, if the wielder of this claymore is in the Night Soul state, the attack percent and crit damage stats are increased by 75% of their original value. All of these stats are incredibly adored by MAVUIKA, and it ends up being her best in slot weapon, though it is not her best by a long shot like most other Natlan units in the game. Beacon of the Reed Sea is a pretty close second, as grants her a good base attack, good crit value, and a 20 or 40% attack boost. This is what truly makes it her second best in slot weapon, but this weapon cannot be obtained anymore, so you probably don't have it. But you might definitely have the Wolf's Gravestone, which is her next best weapon option, as it massively boosts her attack stat in everything she does. On top of that, this passive will also buff the entire team's attack stat, making it the perfect support weapon for her. It's so good in this spot that it could even contend with her signature weapon in terms of team damage output when used with attack scaling party members like Ginich and Emily. Its issue is lack of uptime, as it can only trigger once every other rotation, it lasts only for 12 seconds, and the buff can also be pretty difficult to trigger since the user has to be on field and they have to deal damage to an enemy under 30% of their maximum HP. This can make it very annoying to use, but overall, it will still be a very powerful weapon for a team despite the issues. Verdict also works incredibly with MAVUIKA because of the large base attack, decent crit rate, and additional attack percent it provides passively. The additional passive barely matters too, as it only increases her elemental skill damage. This is good for an off-field MAVUIKA, but it's not useful at all when she is used on field, as all of her damage is elemental burst, normal attack, and charged attack related. However, when used for an off-field MAVUIKA, this will be one of her best claymores she has available. Serpent Spine is the best 4-star weapon MAVUIKA has. It offers her one of the worst base attacks of any weapon in the game, but it also comes with a great crit rate stat and a huge damage percent stat in the passive. These huge bonuses are exactly why this weapon has been so strong since 1.0, and it still proves to be one of the best claymores in the game to this day. Unforged is also good for the large attack stat it can provide that is much more consistent than Wolf's Gravestone, but it desires a shield and cannot buff her team, making it just a good option for her. Redhorn is also great for its huge crit value and extra normal and charge attack scaling. This boosts it to be one of her better weapons available, despite the main flat damage boost not doing much for her. Talking Stick is also pretty strong, mainly because she would want to be used with Bennett, who would constantly apply the Pyro Aura to her to gain the 32% attack buff from the passive. On top of that buff, it passively grants a large base attack and a low crit rate stat, and it can even grant a 24% damage bonus buff if MAVUIKA is applied with a different element. However, this is not consistent, so it might never activate, meaning we might as well not count it. Mountain King's Fang is a great claymore for MAVUIKA due to the large attack stat and crit stat, but the passive will sadly almost never be capped, making it just a decent stat stick. Tidal Shadow is MAVUIKA's best free-to-play weapon due to the insane attack stat it can provide her. However, its large attack percent buff requires the use of a healer. Thankfully, all but one of MAVUIKA's best in slot supports provide healing, making this weapon pretty good for her overall, though she would get about a 10% damage decrease if a healer is not present. Finally, we have the free-to-play but event-exclusive Mailed Flower, which offers a large base attack plus 24% attack and over 200 elemental mastery. These stats are insanely powerful for MAVUIKA. One of them is better used in certain comps. In Vape and Milt teams, Mailed Flower is able to rival the Serpent Spine in terms of damage, but outside of these teams, this weapon will do much worse than many others. So for a free-to-play Mavika, I would suggest using this weapon in these Vape and Milt teams, but when using her outside of these teams, swap over to Title Shadow. Normally, this is where I would put synergies down for a unit. However, Mavika has a huge damage gap between her best and worst teams because her kit relies on Natlan characters to function. So instead, this section is going to be Reliances, which is a bit odd since all other Archons open up team options instead of restricting them. First up is Jalonin, who completes Mavika as a main DPS. This unit is so powerful for Mavika because of her ability to shred the resistances of Pyro, boost Pyro damage percent, act as a defensive support, and re-trigger Mavika's attack percent passive so she can actually utilize it, which no other unit right now can do. Jalonin offers way too much to Mavika right now that it guarantees her a spot as Mavika's best in slot support. This might sound good, but this reliance is so dramatic that you basically have to use Jalonin with Mavika. The only other swap you could make is to Kachina as a free-to-play alternative, but Kachina cannot guarantee the attack buff for Mavika, nor does she have the resistance shredding, leading to about a 25% damage decrease. Zhongli might be another option on your mind as he does have the resistance shredding, but he can't use the scroll set well, he can't grant Mavika her attack percent buff, and he will not grant her fighting spirit stacks. His inability to grant her fighting spirit means she now needs to use her normal attacks, else she cannot use her elemental burst, and even then, her damage percent would be half of what it would be with a Natlan character. All of this combined can end up reducing her damage by almost 50%. While this does go to show how strong of a unit Jalonin is, that's not the full reason as to why Mavika relies solely on her. Instead, it's due to the flaws in the Pyro Archon's kit that were put in place to incentivize pulling for other Natlan characters. As such, the only other defensive support who can come close to this supportive potential is Citlali, as she can provide resistance shredding, damage percent, and melts to Mavika while acting as a Natlan defensive support. However, Citlali cannot re-trigger Night Soul Burst unlike Jalonin, which means Mavika might not have her Sentient 1 passive's attack percent buff. This is fine though, as she offers so much else that enables Mavika to function. On top of that, Citlali also offers persistent off-field cryo application, which is phenomenal since it enables Mavika to use her charged attacks. This is extremely beneficial since using normal attacks on Mavika instead of charged attacks would nerf her damage output by about 10%. Fiorina is the final member to mention, and surprisingly, she is not a Natlan character. What makes Fiorina so insanely strong with Mavika is that she is a damage buffing support that also has automatic and off-field hydro application. This combo is insanely beneficial for Mavika since almost every other hydro support would force her to use her normal attacks, which would decrease her damage output. This specifically is what makes Fiorina work so well with Mavika, as she offers support that can only ever be achieved by maybe one other unit. While all of these units enable Mavika to work the best, you'll notice that for her team comps, Jalonin takes the prize as a practically mandatory prerequisite to Mavika's kit. One of Mavika's current best comps are vape-focused ones, mainly because of Jalonin, like mentioned before. These comps aim to massively boost the damage of Mavika as an on-field hypercarry, since Mavika's damage when massively buffed is freaking ridiculous. The issue with this comp, just like the others, is that it's not super free-to-play friendly, as it heavily desires both Fiorina and Jalonin, since the alternatives heavily nerf her damage. Mavika also has melt comps to make use of too, since her pyro application is pretty low. However, just like with her vape comps, it relies on a specific Natlan defensive support, this time in Citlali. If without this specific unit, you're going to see significantly less success using these teams. Thankfully, you can always run her in a mono pyro damaging team, which offers so many buffs that the loss of Jalonin would matter significantly less. Swapping to Kachina would be far less of a downgrade in these comps, and you can even run Xiangling instead of Kazuha for the pyro res shred. Her last main DPS comp is alongside Chevruz, where she can work decently but not super well because there's no good Natlan unit for these teams other than her. Instead, she has to rely on Overon, who ends up being better for Mavika in these comps despite his own usability getting flushed down the drain. For her sub-DPS teams, Mavika's main strength is that she does not need Bennett to deal damage. This means that Mavika can work amazingly well alongside units like Kinich in burning-centric teams. This is because of her ability to consistently apply Pyro to keep the burning reaction active while buffing Kinich with 80% damage bonus and Emily with 40%. Her addition is exactly what Kinich needed to be an insane damage healing unit, as her role consolidation enables him to be used with many other teammates alongside his now best teammate Emily. This is phenomenal for Kinich, and it will push him to be one of the new best DPS in the game. Chaska also gets a massive buff from Mavika, not only because of the strength of her buffs, but also because they work for every element. This huge 80% damage bonus for Chaska Mawika is amazing for her damage, which consists of 5 different elemental types. This is perfect for Chaska because it finally grants her a very powerful 4th party member, which she never had before, granting her an insane damage boost. Forward vape teams also get a huge damage boost from Mawika because of the 80% damage bonus she can grant them. This is insanely powerful, especially with HP scaling units like Walani and Nuvilet, as Mawika would basically act as a forward vape specific version of Fiorina. She can buff these units even further if she uses the Forest Regalia Claymore, which would reduce her damage but massively boosts the damage of her main DPS from the 120 extra elemental mastery. This can also be done if she's used in melt teams, though there are issues here since there's no off-field cryo Natlin DPS, which means she has to rely on Shalonen for her maximum buff. This can cause issues, especially since one of her best melt damage healers would really benefit from a shield, and they don't normal attack, so Mawika wouldn't be able to use her burst without Shalonen. It's just an issue on top of issue on top of issue for Ganyu. Risley, though, does not benefit largely from a shielder and is a normal attack character, making him the current prime candidate for Mawika's cryo melt DPS. And finally, we have Geo units who all pretty much benefit heavily from the addition of Mawika due to the insane damage percent buff she offers the on-field unit. These units also desire Shalonen too, so there is no real issue with Mawika fitting in. These units also either benefit heavily from the additional damage percent because most of them scale hard with defense, or because she offers additional passive application for more consistency. But now with team comps done, let's end the video off with Mawika's rating. Mawika's personal damage is huge when properly buffed, to the point that it is the highest of any character in the game. This is because of her huge personal damage buffs and incredibly strong artifact set. She's incredible when she is in her peak team comps right now, and while she might fall off a bit without her peak teams, I still think she deserves a strong 5 out of 5 for damage. In terms of application, Mawika's is either once every other hit for her charge attacks, twice per normal attack chain, or once per hit of her off-field elemental skill. This is just normal for an on-field character, and for an off-field pyro character, it's one of the best. That's not saying much when everyone else's pyro application other than Xiangling's is pretty awful, so I think she deserves a 1.5 out of 5. For offensive utility, she has the optional 40% team-wide damage bonus from the Scroll artifact set, which is nice, but it's only present in her kit when she's used as a support. In her base kit, she only has a 40% damage bonus buff to the on-field unit that depletes over time, and this buff can only ever be achieved if she is used alongside another Natlin character. This means that this buff will only ever be 32.5% on average for the on-field unit, which is worse than Yelan, or about 17.5% on average if there is no additional Natlin character. In some situations, this buff is great, and it can be amplified by 40%, but in other situations, it's going to be absolutely negligible to the point you'd honestly prefer Candace over Mawika, earning her an okay 2.5 out of 5 for offensive utility. Mawika's battery potential is good on paper as she generates 5 energy per skill cast. However, she will always be the one absorbing these particles despite her not wanting them, because she will almost never be played with a unit that actually wants them. Her battery potential is practically useless, earning her a 0.5 out of 5. For defensive utility, she has the immunity to being knocked around while in her elemental burst. This sounds great, but it's honestly not too great, earning her a 0.5 out of 5. In terms of flexibility and versatility, Mawika has a lot going for her. She will usually be one of, if not the best pyro unit as an on-field DPS, a sub-DPS, and an offensive support, but only if another Natlin unit is in the party. This is a ridiculous detriment to her kit that heavily limits her potential in many teams, since she needs to be used with 9 other units, and only 3 of these units will actually be there to support her and support the team with her. This is such an absurdly ridiculous detriment that it completely soils the massive potential versatility and flexibility she could have had, earning her a low 1.5 out of 5. Overall, Mawika is a pretty good unit, but she is nowhere near the level of an Archon, as she averages at around a 3.5 rating. Her best aspect is her personal damage, which is absolutely ridiculous, but everything else she has is pretty lukewarm at best. She's purely just a good character with numbers on her side, but is that any reason to pull? For some, yes. For others, no. And for the rest, they're probably pulling for the jiggle physics on her butt when she rides her bike. Everyone has their preferences, but overall, she provides little of value to most people, except if you have multiple other Natlin characters to use her with, you plan to vertically invest, or that dumpy drives you wild. But that's all I have to say about Mawika. Now tell me your thoughts. What do you think of Mawika? How do you intend to play her? How far do you plan to vertically invest? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. But with that, I will skedaddle. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you all next time. Bye bye!